This isn't some little national energy program where they're trying to nationalize an industry. They're trying to legislate it into extinction, which is significantly worse.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, today we are going to be talking about one of our favorite things that we talk about on this show, and that's politics and economics. So, by way of introduction, let's talk about 1980. In 1980, something was descended upon Alberta, and indeed our entire country, but especially Alberta, called the National Energy Program. This is in the aftermath of the first Trudeau, who's sort of to Alberta like Jaws. We ended up blowing up that shark, but the second one has come. Uh, Hopefully, he'll suffer a similar fate politically. But in 1980, this National Energy Program is very important for what we're going to be talking about today, because in 1980, one of Trudeau's first actions, Pierre Trudeau's first actions after he won the election, Joe Clark was ousted after spending a cup of coffee in their prime minister's office, unfortunately. What he did was he brought in something called the National Energy Program. And the NEP, as it was called, was designed to protect Canada's oil supply and promote Canadian ownership of our energy resources. And Petro-Canada was created as a national oil and gas company. That was the stated purpose. The truth of it, though, is that it made Alberta's oil and gas available at cheaper than world prices to Canadian manufacturing companies, especially in Eastern Canada, and further taxed oil and gas profits. And in protest, Alberta's then premier, the late great Peter Lougheed, threatened to cut oil shipments to Eastern Canada. Prices were raised to reflect world prices, but the NEP remained in place until 1984. It became a symbol of the rising feeling of Western Canadian alienation that continues to this day. And as Western Canadians felt and feel taken for granted and pushed around by a federal government more focused on Ontario and especially Quebec. This has been credited, the National Energy Program, with being one of the causes of regionalism, as it created among some the perception of regional disparity. Well, today's guest said this recently in a press release. He said, over the past few years, we've seen the federal government expand further and further beyond its own jurisdiction, leading to a deterioration in federal provincial relations across the country. Sound familiar? This means that we are ultimately hurtling towards a constitutional convention, one way or another, whether we like it or not. And that's why he's emphasizing how important it is for us, Alberta, to win the battle of ideas. His name is Josh Andrus of Project Confederation, friend of the show. He's been on before, but today we're going to take a little bit more in-depth view in talking about this just transition, also known as the Justin transition. One wonders if that's a mistake, like just inflation. But
Well,
before we
just
get,
in case, let's
yeah,
not.
there you go. So before we get to introduce to Josh properly, as we always do, we're going to go to the aphorisms board, and these ones are going to have a bit of a Trudeau focus, Trudeau family focus. The first one is from Pierre Trudeau, who we just talked about a little bit, and he once was quoted as saying this: "We wish nothing more, but we will accept nothing less. Masters in our own house we must be, but our house is the whole of Canada." Now here's Justin Trudeau talking about his father. He said, "My father's values and vision of this country obviously form everything I have as values and ideals, but this is not the ghost of my father. This is me." Coming back to my Jaws analogy. And then finally, we have someone who's not Canadian, but I think a very prescient, relevant comment. This is from Henry Kissinger, who's actually still around, folks. He's very connected to the World Economic Forum. Kissinger wrote this. He said, "Who controls the food supply controls the people. Who controls the energy can control whole continents. Who controls money can control the world." So who do we have on the show today? Josh Andrus, friend of the show. He's the executive director of Project Confederation at the Alberta Institute, an independent, libertarian-minded public policy think tank that aims to advance personal freedom and choice in Alberta. He is a fourth-generation Albertan from Drumheller and holds a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Lethbridge, majoring in economics and minoring in political science. Prior to joining the Alberta Institute, Josh worked as the executive director for a grassroots advocacy organization and volunteered in several political and policy roles. And I should tell you that Confederation Project and Alberta First have been very, very influential in development of certain policies that have found their way into law, not the least of which is the Alberta Sovereignty Act. So, Josh, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me back. I'm glad it went so well last time that I got invited, or I had to invite myself, I guess, but I did get back on the show, so I'm happy with that.
Yes, the episode that you were on previously got a lot of views, and we're grateful for that you spent the time with us, and then you've come back. But today we want to talk about this sort of second coming of the national energy policy, only this time it's worse. Back then it was just about price control and management of resources for the benefit of a certain part of Canada. Now the shark has come for the whole thing and is going to swallow the oil and gas industry whole. And you've written about this, a recent piece that you wrote in the Western Standard, which I recommend people check out, called Just Transition to What? And you say no unjust transition. Sign the No Unjust Transition petition, and if you could talk about that a little bit too, to help stop the federal ban on oil and gas that will destroy jobs in the economy. So tell us about just transition. Why is this so important and should be a very, very deep concern, not only to Albertans, but to all Canadians, Josh?
Well, I think the Jaws theme song should almost be running in the background while I talk here, because it's very much a similar concept. I mean, it is worse than the National Energy Program. The National Energy Program was very much about resource control. This is more of a human capital transfer program. They literally want to shut down jobs in Alberta and is seeming to want to move them to Ontario. Now, these are weaker paying jobs. I mean, green energy doesn't have the cash or the profitability of the natural resource sector, so incomes will drop. And it's not only that, like, they literally want to take people out of Alberta, and with the people goes the wealth, right? Mm-hmm. So this isn't some little national energy program where they're trying to nationalize an industry. They're trying to legislate it into extinction, which is significantly worse. It sounds like they're going to be bringing it forward at some point in the next few weeks here, whether that's before Alberta's provincial election writ drops or not is another question. But yeah, it is literally, this is the end game for the Liberals on their energy policy. And we are, I think one of the themes, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has hit this very well on affordability, in the sense that energy is the industry that powers every other industry. And I've talked about this, and I think you guys at the Alberta Prosperity Project had Alex Epstein on as a guest. And I thought I really like what he says, but he makes a really, really good point that prosperity and economic activity depends on affordable, reliable energy. And what the Liberals are doing is they are legislating affordable, reliable energy out of existence, or at least attempting to. And that's going to really create some issues across the country when it comes to affordability. This isn't just a provincial issue. This isn't just going to impact Alberta, although 187,000 out of the 202,000 lost jobs, according to a memo, I think it was a Natural Resources internal memo, stated that if they go ahead with the just transition, it will lose 187,000 jobs in Alberta. But it will have impacts across the country. I mean, think about the manufacturing industries, and every other industry in Eastern Canada that requires an energy input is going to see their energy costs go up. And that's going to lead to shortages on the supply line. It's going to lead to capital flight. I mean, why would GM, outside of massive government subsidies, be running a plant in Ontario where your energy costs have skyrocketed? Why not just run it in Mexico, right? Or China or something like that. So you do have the potential here with this legislation to have significantly negative impacts across the country. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as we head into spring here. We got about, I don't know, the legislation should be tabled soon. And once it is, I think we're going to be ready to go. I think we do have a petition with 12,000 plus signatures already. I don't see any like if it is what they say it's going to be and what the internal memos are going to be, I don't see any reason why that's not going to hit 60,000, 70,000, right? I mean, again, that's, I mean, I know I've seen some people say that, oh yeah, we're going to get 600,000 signatures on a petition. I mean, we're not going to go that far, but I do know that it's going to be a big issue, and we're going to be front and center on it, and we have to be, because like you said, we have to win the battle of ideas. If we keep going down this road and we keep, watering down our positions and, being unprepared for what is inevitably coming from the federal government, we're going to lose, and we can't afford to lose.
Speaking of ideas, this just seems to be really, really bad ideas, and contrary to some of the best information that's out there about the relationship between environmental concerns and wealth and wealth generation. For example, you mentioned the Epstein book, which is called Fossil Future, one of the books that's featured. But if you look at, for example, Michael Schellenberger's book, which is called Apocalypse Never, Bjorn Lomborg, who's written a book called False Alarm, they all posit the same theory and it's based upon hard data, that in fact, until people reach a certain level of basic income, which is about $3,000 a year, they don't give a farthing about the environment. And in fact, it's capitalism that has the ability to raise people out of poverty. And when people are raised out of poverty, that's when they start to become more environmentally responsible. And this is based upon data. So let's park that for a second. And then we have this other thing that you probably saw about Imperial Oil posted their record profits in the last quarter of 2022, based largely upon Alberta. And they mentioned, I saw an article in the Western Standard that mentioned specifically my hometown, Cold Lake, and the oil sands projects there. So we have really record profits. So the demand for oil and gas in the world has never been higher. And Alberta is sitting on this incredible reservoir of that. And of course, all of the people, that's the greatest resource, the people who can produce this wealth. And the production of this wealth is going to be the best thing for the environment based upon all the data. But then we have a federal government that, Dr. Robert Malone, who was recently on the show, described that has made Canada into a WEF client state, so that you could take the WEF's policy and overlay that and look at what the Canadian government is doing. And they just seem to be so ideologically focused upon that policy, and they're ignoring all of the real data that we just talked about. So, Josh, my question for you is, how do we fight this? I mean, the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has asked for a meeting with Justin Trudeau to talk this out, and she's received no response. So how are we going to fight this? How are we going to prevent this disaster, this shark from coming and swallowing up not only Alberta's greatest resource, but really what fuels all of Canada?
I think you hit the nail on the head in the way that you framed the question, actually. The way we combat is just to speak sense. I mean, how ethical is it that the idea to shut down affordable energy is coming from the most expensive, highly rated educational institutions in the world? I mean, these are Stanford environmental profs that are predicting that in the and Epstein talks about this, but in the 1950s, there was, I think it was Barack Obama's chief science advisor was predicting that the British Isles would be underwater by 1975 or something like that. So we have these
Plymouth Rock is fine. Plymouth Rock is fine.
As Rick Bell would put it, the eggiest of eggheads predicting mass doom for the world if we don't do something, or if we don't change the way we live and give more power to the government. I mean, it seems to be that way. Now, the reason that I'm not panicking like I've seen some others on this issue is because of how fundamentally wrong I think it is, and how fundamentally I don't think it's going to work. I mean, if you go back to the argument that we laid out, and you that the energy industry is the industry that powers every other industry, and we have the Western Hemisphere, that the Western world for like Europe, America, Canada has effectively made it difficult for us to produce energy at an affordable rate. We have taken on this green crusade that has left us incredibly vulnerable to fluctuating energy prices, where we one rocket launched the wrong place in Ukraine could set something off, or maybe the Iranian dictator looks at the Saudi Arabian dictator the wrong way in a meeting like that. It's the little where we're kind of left vulnerable in a sense. And it's that vulnerability that I think is going to start driving change the other way. I think we've hit that point where the public is starting to look at their pocketbooks and think, I don't have as much money as I did last month, but I'm making a little bit more. How does that work? And so questions are starting to be asked, and we're seeing it in the global markets as well. I mean, there has been a definite shift in market conditions. The leaders on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, your Apples, your Amazons, your Netflix, your Facebooks, they have all seen their stock price deteriorate because people are starting to worry about their financial conditions. How much stuff can they buy on Amazon anymore if it's going to be more expensive? So we are starting to see a shift, but that all goes back to the fact that affordable energy is the driving force of prosperity, really. I mean, if you have energy costs that are skyrocketing, that's going to lead to inflation. We aren't at the point where there's lineups at the grocery store for bread every morning, but I think that's kind of starting to, like, at least the eggheads on my side are starting to think about that, right? We may not be as eggy as some of the eggheads on the left, but at the end of the day, this is where the fight is going to be. It's going to be the battle of ideas, but it comes down to the fact that, like I said, there's fundamental issues between this global energy strategy that has been pioneered over the last 2 decades. And I think you're going to start seeing a shift back through democratic means to a more energy, to focus more on energy affordability and how that impacts price increases, I think is really what we're going to see.
What are the things that to me is so consternating about the behavior of this government is coming back to that Kissinger comment where he says basically to have energy, because it's something that is ubiquitous, that every nation, every person needs. And it's become the expression of wealth in the world and power. And here, Alberta and Canada, by extension, is sitting on this enormous reservoir of wealth, and that could be the key to solving so many problems in our country. We're a country that is hopelessly in debt. This prime minister has doubled our national debt in the time that he's been prime minister, which is less than 10 years. To stop and think, drink that in for a moment. But what could Canada be? What could Canada be? And what could Alberta be if this power were literally unleashed? And yet our federal government seems to be intent upon going in the other direction. And is it possible? Is it conceivable that our federal government actually wants to weaken the political might of our country, to make us less of a player internationally, to make us more unstable economically? That our governors do not want Canada to be a great country? It almost beggars belief that could be so. But at the same time, when you look at their actions and their policies, they seem to be going completely in the wrong direction in terms of making Canada a great nation on the world stage, which is entirely possible, isn't it, Josh? It's entirely possible if we had the right policies.
Like I think this is less about economic prosperity, more about political power. I mean, if there's one thing that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years here is that Western Canada has gone from being a small bit player within Confederation to one of an absolute powerhouse. I mean, from an economic standpoint, we are the engine that has driven the Canadian economy and did so for 9.5 years under Stephen Harper. We started to our population growth relative to the rest of the country skyrocketed. We are subsidizing almost every single national transfer program or social program or any federal program that gives money to the provinces. We are subsidizing it. And for a long time that really didn't, I mean, it bugged some people, Like if you went and knocked on a door down in Milk River on some farm, he might tell you to get the hell out of there, right? Because he wants to leave. But during Harper's reign, it wasn't that big of an issue. Now what we've seen is, because of the shift in demographics, in power structure, and money within the nation, Ontario and Quebec saw their influence in federal affairs start to diminish. A prime minister from Alberta dominated federal politics for 9.5 years. Stephen Harper came in. He pushed the establishment Liberal Party to the third party position with the rise of Jack Leighton. So I think what happened was, by the time Trudeau came into power, he was like, I got to get those guys. Like, this is about power, because the last thing Ontario and Quebec want is to cede any more power to the West. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to at some point, or there won't be a West to cede to. But I think that we're starting to see, I really think that that's been the approach from the federal government, that it's not about like personal grievances or anything like that. It's about power. I mean, they currently have 199 seats in the House and Commons, and I talked about this on another program last week. But those 199 out of the 338 seats in the House of Commons actually have a more centralized role, because of the way that our country is governed. Most decisions come out of the prime minister's office, right? I mean, when the prime minister makes a decision, or his team makes a decision, then the House of Commons votes in favor of whatever the party in power wants it to do, and then the provinces are forced to deal with it. And I think, and then you go through the courts and you get to the Supreme Court and you run into problems there, right? Because it's appointed by the prime minister. So we do have a power structure that is centralized in the hands of really a small group of people. And there really aren't any checks and balances. And so when you get a party that figures out that if they control Ontario and Quebec, at least enough of it to win a majority or even a minority, they can dictate to the West what to do, because the West only has a small proportional amount of power relative to the influence that we wield. And I think that that's really what the crux of the issue here is that we don't have a lot of power to defend ourselves. And I do think we've seen movements. Obviously, Rob Anderson at before he left the Free Alberta Strategy, he was really good on that. The Free Alberta Strategy being a set of policies designed to really take the next step in protecting Alberta's interests. And Project Confederation has shared a lot of those things as well. Rob and I work closely together over his time with the Alberta Institute. So it's one of those things where we are seeing significant pushback from Alberta. And I think the federal government is taking notice. It'll be interesting to see what the just transition actually looks like, right? I mean, is it what they're saying it's going to be? Or maybe they'll tone it down a little bit because they don't want to pick that fight. Because on the other side of the country, Quebec has a bunch of rogue Parti Québécois MPs who are running roughshod through Francois Legault's premiership right now. And so there's agitation in Quebec. And anytime the federal government overreaches, the people of Quebec are watching, even if it happens in Alberta. So we have all these little fires going on. And it'll be very interesting to see what that just transition legislation ends up looking like on the surface. And what it's been signaled by federal leadership is that it is going to be a transition out of Alberta, that jobs will be transitioned out of Alberta. And even if they do manage to replace the jobs in Alberta, you're going to be going from making $90, $100 an hour to making $30 an hour driving a bus or being a janitor in a storage facility. And they don't talk about, the environmental costs of some of these green energy proposals, right? I mean, solar farms, like land reclamation on a solar farm like that field will never have a crop on it again. The amount of materials and stuff that go into the batteries in a Tesla, right? Like there's lithium mines around the world. So we have even if they do manage to replace the jobs, the money's not going to be the same. So it really is going to be devastating to not just Alberta's economy, but to the entire country.
Well, we've talked in sort of in broad terms about this just transition. Let's get into the guts of it a little bit. And I'm drawing from some of the writing that you've done recently about it. You've said that it's illegal. It's illegal because Canada was intended to be a federation, a union of mostly self-governing provinces. That confederation created a system whereby there is a clear division of powers between the federal government and the provinces, not a hierarchy of government authority, so that there's this national. Canada doesn't have a national government, even though Liberals behave as though we do. We don't have a national government. So you're saying that this just transition is actually an unconstitutional infringement of provincial rights by a federal government that doesn't seem to care about following the Constitution of the rule of law. It's illegal. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe this is going to be challenged in court by the provincial government on the grounds that natural resources is provincial jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. I think that because of the amount of jobs this impacts, this isn't a tax. This is a legitimate human capital transfer program. I think that's going to be a difference. Whether or not I think the Alberta Court of Appeals will agree with us. I think there's going to be interveners on behalf of the Alberta government. We saw that with Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, right? It was challenged in the Alberta Court of Appeals. Alberta won that decision with the help of 8 other provinces helping us on our behalf. So I do think this is going to be challenged in court. I do think it's illegal. I do think it goes against the Constitution, not just in spirit, but in legislation. Mm-hmm. I think that the Constitution very clearly gives us a right to use our natural resources. Like, it is a provincial jurisdiction, and the federal government is overreaching by 100 times anything they've ever tried to do before. Mm-hmm. Whether or not the Supreme Court agrees with us is a different thing. But the only way that we can move forward with this is to fight it. And at the end of the day, I do think that there is a huge appetite amongst Albertans, especially, to stand up and fight and to see our government take legitimate steps. If that means using the Sovereignty Act, that means using the Sovereignty Act. If that means bringing in some more legislation, that means bringing in some more legislation. If the Liberals want to get on this hill right now, we'll die on it. Mm-hmm. And I said this in another program the other day. The nice thing about politics, as Winston Churchill likes to say, is politics is like war. It's just as exciting, except for you. Instead of dying once, you can die over and over and over again. And I'm paraphrasing, but I'm getting on that hill. I'll tell you that much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've also said you said it's illegal, and I happen to agree with you. It certainly is unconstitutional, but you've also said it's insane to think that in the blink of an eye, Canada can simply abandon its oil and gas industry that's so economically irresponsible. You say it's frankly insane. Current or even foreseeable future renewables technology simply cannot entirely replace oil and gas. You want to talk about that?
Oh, we did a little bit already. I mean, this is an affordability crisis. Like I said, we don't have lineups at the grocery store yet, but I'm guaranteeing you every time, even if for a bag of salads, you're paying $1.50 more than you were 2 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's an increase of 10 to 15% on everything since the pandemic started, right? I mean, mm-hmm. We have an affordability crisis driven by multiple factors. I mean, number one, there's too much money in the system. Monetary and fiscal policy is way overshot its mark. It's when you got that much money in the system, it's chasing too few goods. Now, those few goods are even fewer because we've got supply chain issues because we've locked down. But at the end of the day, the inflation didn't really take off until Russia invaded Ukraine and energy prices skyrocketed, and then people started panicking about the price at the pump, which led to we can alleviate so much pressure on people's wallets by unlocking Alberta's energy. Mm-hmm. And it's insane that we're not. It's insane that not only are we are making it harder to produce the energy that we need to live our everyday lives, to heat our homes. Like, I mean, can you imagine being a low-income family in, I don't know, some northern Ontario, somewhere on James Lake or James Bay, maybe, mm-hmm, where mm-hmm. you're trying to choose between eating.
My wife's hometown of Wawa, where the goose is.
Wawa, yeah. Like, I mean, that's the thing. Like, you don't know what's going on, but this is mm-hmm. it's not. it's not that, it's not the lawyer in Cold Lake that's going to hurt from this. I mean, you might a little bit, but it's going to be that small, low income family that's trying to, raise a family and keep their kids in sports and all of that. That's who it's going to hit. And that to me is, especially for a government that claims to be concerned about the welfare of the middle class or even the lower class, they're hurting people. And that to me is over the line. And I do believe that this policy is, for that reason and for others that I probably shouldn't say on the air, I think it's insane. And I am not surprised that we're headed in this direction, but like I said, I'm going to be on that hill.
So you're saying that when Mr. Singh, the leader of the federal NDP party, goes on Twitter and says that inflation is being caused by greedy CEOs of grocery and oil and gas companies, and that the healthcare is too expensive because we're privatizing it. You're saying he's what I like to call wrong?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
So the next thing
yeah.
you said is that it's immoral. And by the way, I love your use of assonance, where you've used the letter I for all of these. That's wonderful. You said it's immoral. Millions of people around the world are still living in energy poverty. They're burning coal, wood, or even dung to survive, causing health problems from breathing in toxic fumes. They're unable to operate their businesses or do their homework in the evening because they don't have the electricity needed to power lights after it goes dark. In this context, we should mention our Prime Minister, when Germany and Japan recently came to him and said, hey, we really need some of that gas that you have out in Alberta and Saskatchewan, he said, talk to the hand. And people in Germany and Japan are really suffering right now because of that they don't have access. They're both reliable upon sources of gas that come from Russia and other parts of the world, and they don't have access to them. There's problems with supply chains, and Canada says, no, we're not going to help you. That's immoral too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, talk about drinking water for a minute. I mean, I got up this morning. I had a cup of water that I got out of a tap. I had a shower, cleaned myself up. I came down here. I'll probably have a nice warm breakfast after I'm done here. Maybe. I don't know. But these to me are just everyday things, right? But in a poorer nation, and this doesn't just apply to Germany and Japan. And I will say, though, Germany did build an LNG plant offshore in 96 days, which is quite an achievement. And German engineering, you know what I mean?
Yes. And the Americans obliged them, right?
If you think about some of these countries that are like in the deep, that have been impoverished for, like when you watch it, when you're watching the Super Bowl and there's please, if you donate $1 a day, you can put a child through school. Like, that is some of the most impoverished places in the world. They don't have running water. They don't have, air conditioning in their house. Like, they're living in huts. And the fact that we have this approach that energy is going to destroy everything. Like, why can't we give them basic necessities? And energy is what provides those basic necessities. And yeah, I think it's immoral for us to be sitting in our ivory towers talking down to condescendingly to the rest of the world, saying, well, you know what, we're going to save the world, when there's people dying in Africa that don't have access to basic necessities, that don't have power in their hospitals. Like, they don't have x-ray machine. Like, this is the world we're living in, where we've got a bunch of people with their cushy government jobs making six figures, looking down on people of the world as if they're trying to save them. But these people don't have basic necessities that energy can provide, right? And we like, to me, that is one of the biggest immoralities of this entire thing, is that we're well off here. We've got a good life, and we should be sharing that with the rest of the world, whether it's to Japan, Germany, or some of these other places, and we're not. And it really is tragic.
And you've said that getting this transition wrong could be catastrophic, and that really there's nothing just about it. It's actually unjust. And you draw an interesting comparison here. You say that the last time the federal government shut down an entire industry, it resulted in the single largest mass layoff in the country's history. Roughly 30,000 people in Newfoundland were put out of work thanks to the cod fishing moratorium. And you fear that this just transition is going to be just a reduction in household income, just a loss of livelihoods, just the loss of the wholesale destruction of an entire industry. So you say, in addition to being immoral, insane, and illegal, actually, this just transition is quite unjust to the Canadian people, right?
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that. I sent that when we sent that out, we got an email back from Brian Peckford. So we caught his attention. He was premier of Newfoundland back then.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, yeah, like that is what's going on here. And it is devastating when you think about it. Like, I mean, Newfoundland, I mean, it's hard to go anywhere in Calgary without running into someone from Newfoundland. I mean, even in Alberta politics, there's so many transplanted Newfoundlanders in this province that are probably some of the most passionate people you've ever met. And they'll sit there and they'll regale you tales about driving across Newfoundland and how it took a 7-hour drive took 14 and maybe hours, and they saw every form of weather they can. Like, they will literally sit there and they love where they're from. And I think I love having them here, but it's sad in a way that they can't find, steady employment in their home province, and they haven't been for years. And like, it really is, it's devastating, and it's sad, and it's not just, it really isn't. I mean, these people should have the ability to find jobs in their home, to build a life where they're from, but they can't because their industry was shut down by a government that was trying to do the right thing but hurt a lot of people, and they're still hurting. I mean, there's a lot of pride in Newfies, but you can almost see a sadness in their eyes, and it's sad when you think about it, because it worries me that that's what's going to happen here. And we saw it a little bit from 2014 to 2020 there. People were losing their homes. They were losing their jobs. They were selling their trucks. They were declaring bankruptcy. They were getting divorced. They were like, I mean, it was probably one of the most heart-wrenching periods, because everywhere you looked, like, you had a friend down, like, it was, man, like, somebody's getting divorced, or somebody lost their job. And that's what scares me more than the words just transition. It's the impact it has on the soul of the province. And I'm worried about it. I'm worried about that, because Alberta is a very strong, proud, fierce people. I mean, we are the sons and daughters of pioneers who came to this province seeking a better life, and this province gave it to them. I mean, think about, could you imagine being in the fishery industry and then moving to Alberta and then having that job taken from you? I mean, this is a government that and I talked about it earlier, they're more concerned about control than they are about justice or about prosperity. It's to them, and we saw that with their invocation of the Emergencies Act to deal with the Ottawa protests. That yeah, there were some kooks in the crowd, but you can't paint everybody with the same brush. Like, there were a lot of people that were just upset with the way that they've been treated. They lost their jobs. They hopped in a truck and they drove to Ottawa, and they sat there waiting for change. And the federal government came down hard on them, and now Alberta has brought in the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which is supposed to defend our interests, and the federal government seems to be dedicated to one-upping us and slapping us down again. And I think there's going to be a lot of anger once that happens, if it happens. Maybe the Sovereignty Act is having its desired effect. Maybe the just transition legislation won't be as bad as everybody seems to think it will be. But I'm not hedging my bet on that. I mean, if it is, great, but if not, let's go.
What one other way to describe the just transition is an example of ingratitude. That how the government of Canada is really not grateful for Alberta and for the energy that it produces and the wealth it produces for the rest of Canada. We recently had on this program a man named Ivan Bombach, who's a retired lawyer, friend of mine. He's very involved in patriating people from the Ukraine who are coming here from war-torn country. He described just how grateful they are to come to Alberta, how amazed they are by the people here, and just the availability of things like water and food and energy, and just the opportunity that they have to live a good life here. And as you say, that just transition has the potential to destroy all of that. And imagine how they would feel coming from a war-torn country to a place like Alberta, which must seem like a paradise, and then have that all destroyed. So your point there is well taken. The morale of the people of Alberta is an important factor, and it's one that when we talk about Western alienation, we started off the program talking about the National Energy Program, and I'm old enough to remember that, and not the name Pierre Trudeau had to be spat out of your mouth at our dinner table as a kid. But we're that level of Western alienation that existed back then, I think, is much worse now. That's my sense.
It's a cult. I think it's not. I actually I do think it's worse. I do think it's worse in the sense that the federal government has gone so much further. I think there's always going to be an undercurrent of independence-minded people. And I would even go as far as say there's probably an undercurrent of 10 to 15% of the Alberta population that will always be separatist, which is a high number if you really break it down. But like even in good times, there's that frustration, and it's something that's ingrained in our history. It's ingrained in our culture. I mean, it goes back to when we first settled the province, right? I mean, it goes back to before that, Rupert's Land, where Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and parts of BC, I think, that was the land that we were formed out of, and it was purchased in 1868 by the federal government to mine our resources to send back to Eastern Canada to help with their industries there. And over time, people moved, and then they started settling Alberta, and people got here and they're like, we're getting a raw deal. I don't want to send my stuff to Ottawa for pennies on the dollar. I want to sell it across the southern border to Montana or to Chicago if you're in, Winnipeg, right? Like, so you ended up with the situation where there was agitation right out of the gate. So our forefathers and our grandparents and great grandparents, they got here and they got mad at the federal government. And if you look through Alberta's history, and this is something that's unique, if you look at federal elections and what Albertans elected and what the federal government ended up being, they're usually two different things. Even when Diefenbaker won his first term, Alberta elected mostly social credit MPs, right? Like, so there is an interesting parallel there that it is ingrained in our culture. But I think that we're not feeling as alienated as we used to. We're more feeling pissed, for lack of a better term, right? Like there's just an underlying, like we are Albertans are, like we are, like it is in our culture to be resilient. I mean, we have gone through depressions, we have gone through droughts, we have gone through oil price crashes. Like we go through it, we dig our heels in, and we get up in the morning, we get the job done, right? That's just what we do. And I think that has turned into a just F off kind of a mentality from people, like, and you see it, and I talked about this on another program, but you don't have to go too far outside of the city of Calgary to see an F Trudeau flag.
Second highest selling flag on Amazon in Canada.
Exactly, right? Like that's the thing. And this isn't just alienation. This isn't just a minor annoyance, right? Like, but if you go back, like even before the National Energy Program, you had the Canadian Wheat Board. You've had, we didn't have control of our natural resources until John Brownlee had to took a train to Ottawa and refused to leave the city until we had natural resources. control over our natural resources, which even at the time was constitutionally mandated to us in the British North America Act. So this is a part of our culture, but we are an entrepreneurial, pioneering culture. And I do think I think we can push back enough on this that hopefully they back down. Hopefully that it doesn't come. But if it comes, we got to be ready. And at that point, I think the people of Alberta will dig in. I think that there's a lot of bridges that we can build between various organizations as well to kind of hold hands and make sure that this doesn't kill us, because it does have the potential to really destroy the very foundation and the very thing that we're proud of. And that's our ability to, in difficult and sometimes seemingly impossible conditions, create wealth and create jobs. I mean, there's a reason The Last of Us was filmed here. And it is because we have a beautiful landscape that in some ways, I'm sure the first people to lay their eyes on it were awed by how terrifying and of a spectacle some of these mountains are, and how this is not an easy province to create wealth in. And I think it speaks to the innovation ability of the people here. I mean, we have some of the brightest engineers in the province that are going to be out of work if this happens. So yeah, it's absolutely devastating. It's completely unjust, but we are used to injustice when it comes to Ottawa, and we're used to standing up, and we're used to digging our heels in and fighting it.
One of the things that I've noticed is that the anger towards the federal government is no longer unique to Alberta. This is as an aside, but my friend and I were watching an old video from the early 1990s or late 1990s. I believe it was 1997, and it was the famous Shawinigan handshake when then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was making his way through, kind of an unfriendly crowd who were booing him. He had almost no security detail, and one fellow stepped up to him, and Jean Chrétien just brushed him aside. Well, compare that to last week watching the Prime Minister cross the street in Hamilton. The huge security detail. You could not throw a rock and get near him. He was completely cloistered and protected. That's just a sign of how things have changed, sadly, in this country, and how little respect people have for the office of the Prime Minister. Unfortunately, how far the respect for that office has fallen during Mr. Trudeau's tenure. But Josh, I want to ask you finally about, and you mentioned this, or I mentioned this off the top. Project Confederation really thinks that we need to have a constitutional convention. And in this context, you published something recently about a $420 million equalization payment to Ontario, how that goes too far. Why is it that Project Confederation is of the view that we need a constitutional convention in Canada? Is it just the situation in Alberta and just transition, or is there more to that? Is there more to the picture that makes you think that we need a full constitutional convention to take a new look at how the Federation of Canada is working, if indeed it's working at all?
I don't think it's so much that I think we need one. I do think we need one, but I just think we're going to have one. I don't think we really have a choice in the matter at this point. It is more than just Alberta. I mean, there's a meeting, a summit of premiers. They're going to meet to discuss the current healthcare crisis, because we can't seem to go a year without a healthcare crisis. And the federal government,
crisis.
Or any crisis. But the federal government is attempting to. They want to help, right? But there's a condition. The condition is they want healthcare data, and that is not going over well with really any province. BC's health minister has stood up against it, which is surprising because they're usually relatively allied with the federal government. Alberta, of course, is not okay with it. Saskatchewan's chomping at the bit. I've seen Quebec is not happy with it either. So that's one issue. You've got the just transition, which we've talked at length about. We've got they're going to remove nitrogen from fertilizer, which is going to hurt Saskatchewan's economy. It's going to hurt our crops. And Saskatchewan's got a heavy potash deposits, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there you've got fertilizer, crops, they're in agriculture, they're in the notwithstanding clause. And I've
Oh,
talked about
yes.
this before, right? Like, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Ontario has been liberalizing the use of the notwithstanding clause to deal with as a way to kind of get around the Supreme Court. Let's just call it
Right.
what it is. The Supreme Court had a ruling on the constitutionality of strikes. Ontario doesn't like it, so they're going to use the notwithstanding clause. What that's done is it's forced Trudeau to basically say, okay, I don't think you should use it. Now, that has made Quebec upset.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how Quebec is the outlaw, is the most interesting part of this entire equation. Like, and you'd be surprised. I'm surprised by how much support we have in Quebec for Project Confederation, even for the Free Alberta strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when we send a national communication out, we get a lot of, good for you, way to go is out of Quebec, because they see a lot of parallels between our situation and their situation. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we do, in some sense, have unique cultures. I believe that Quebec, I'm not going to stand here and say that Quebec is not unique in its culture.
Oh, of course.
I mean, that would be completely
Mm-hmm.
insane of me to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Alberta's got a unique culture, and I think you're starting to see these regional disparities really play out. I mean, for everything that Francois Legault has done for Quebec on a cultural front, his government, the CAQ, has taken a very clear approach. They want to have all the Quebec separatists under their umbrella. They
Mm-hmm.
want to kill the Parti Québécois,
Mm-hmm.
but they have not succeeded in that. And that was one of the takeaways from the 2022 Quebec election, is that the Parti Québécois, despite everything Legault has done, is still in the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
They've got a younger, dynamic leader. They're still alive. They're agitating. And the more pressure they're able to put on Legault, the more pressure Legault is going to put on Trudeau. So you've got all of these situations. The Maritimes is probably there's issues there too, right? So you've got all of these issues. You've got First Nations are they're hammering and chomping at the bit. They're not happy with things. I mean, some of the federal promises haven't, materialized, like clean drinking water for
Mm-hmm.
the people. They want self-governance in some way. So yeah, there's a lot of different situations that are all seeming to flare up at once. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it has something to do with, and this is why I think it's inevitable, is there is a vacuum in terms of leadership, and it's not that it's not there. I mean, you could argue that it is not there, but I'm going to take it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say that they're trying to suck all the power in.
Yep.
To the prime minister's office. They're trying to centralize control of everything. That Supreme Court ruling from March, April of 2021, where they ruled that the carbon tax was constitutional, and despite three dissenting opinions, and the dissenting opinion was essentially that this creates a Trojan horse that now, by use of the peace, order, and good governance clause of the Constitution, which gives the federal government control, like they can supersede provincial jurisdiction in certain cases that they feel affect the peace, order, and good governance of the country. They can use literally any federal jurisdiction to override provincial jurisdiction. And what that means is, like, as they do that, it's like they're trying to suck the life out of everybody that opposes them. But I don't think you're going to get away with that here. No, I really don't. There is so much life in the province of Alberta. There is so much passion and fire. And like, we saw that. I mean, the bulk of the protesters, I want to say, not all of them, but I'd say the bulk of the protesters that drove all the way to Ottawa were from Alberta. Like,
certainly many of the organizers. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, we're at the point now where, the vacuum is going to suck up something that I don't think the federal government really wants. And that is a constitutional convention. I don't think there's a way around it at this point.
There, you make some great points. And isn't it ironic in the sense that Quebec, the Prime Minister's home province, is aligned with Alberta. One interesting point about Quebec, I saw just yesterday, they announced that they're taking a diametrically opposed view to the federal government on COVID, where they're only going to recommend vaccinations for people who are vulnerable and who have not had COVID. So they're looking at hybrid immunity, which our federal government thinks doesn't exist. Anyway, Josh, this has been really,
I
really
didn't see
stimulating.
that until
Yes, it's yeah, they're stepping out more aligned with what our premier here in Alberta is saying about COVID in terms of policy. Josh, great conversation, great points. I'd like to turn to our reading list, and you know about this, so hopefully you have a couple of good suggestions for us. The first one I have is from someone whom I know you and I both admire, the late Roger Scruton, a British philosopher, wrote many books, but actually one of them he wrote about the case for an environmental conservatism. This is a book called How to Think Seriously About the Planet, the case for an environmental conservatism. And in that book, Dr. Scruton says that the environment has long been the undisputed territory of the political left, which casts international capitalism, consumerism, and the overexploitation of natural resources as the principal threats to the planet and sees top-down interventions as the most effective solution. But this book rejects that view, and it offers a fresh approach to tackling the most important political problem of our time. That's the environmental movement, he contends, is philosophically confused and has unrealistic agendas. Its sights are directed at the large-scale events and the confrontation between international politics and multinational business. But Scruton argues that no large-scale environmental project, however well-intentioned, will succeed if it is not rooted in small-scale practical reasoning. He says seeing things on a large scale promotes top-down solutions managed by unaccountable bureaucracies that fail to assess local conditions and are rife with unintended consequences. I think we've seen that played out in real life. Scruton argues for the greater efficacy of local initiatives, like what we're doing in Alberta, over global schemes, civil association over political activism, and small-scale institutions of friendship over regulatory hypervigilance like the just transition. And he suggests that conservatism is far better suited to solving environmental problems than either liberalism or socialism. Rather than entrusting the government, the environment to unwieldy NGOs and international committees, he says we must assume personal responsibility and foster local control. People must be empowered to take charge of their environment, to care for it as they would a home, and to involve themselves through the kind of local associations that have been the traditional goal of conservative politics. The second book is one that we mentioned earlier, that in fact our guest did. It's from an author named Alex Epstein called Fossil Future. In this book, Epstein says that for over a decade, philosopher and energy expert Alex Epstein has predicted that any negative impacts of fossil fuel use on our climate will be outweighed by the unique benefits of fossil fuels to human flourishing. And he's not alone in this opinion, including their unrivaled ability to provide low-cost, reliable energy to billions of people around the world, especially the world's poorest. And contrary to what we hear from media experts about today's renewable revolution and climate emergency, reality has proven him right. The fact is that fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy around the world and growing fast, while much hyped renewables are causing skyrocketing electricity prices, increased blackouts, and also slavery, if you take a look at what's going on at a lithium mine. The fact is that fossil fuel development has brought global poverty to an all-time low. And actually, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, recent guest on this program, talked about that. While fossil fuels have contributed to the 1 degree warming in the last 170 years, that's worst case, climate-related deaths are at all-time lows thanks to fossil-fueled development. And he asks, what does the future hold? And he says, applying his distinctive human flourishing network to the latest evidence, he comes to the shocking conclusion that the benefits of fossil fuels will continue to far outweigh their side effects. The last book I want to mention is kind of a funny one. It's not a new book. It's by a lady named Mary Janigan. It's called Let the Eastern Bastards Freeze in the Dark, the West versus the Rest since Confederation. Josh knows about this one. The synopsis is the oil sands, global warming, national energy program. Though these seem like modern Canadian subjects, author Mary Janigan reveals them to be a legacy of long-standing regional rivalry, something of a third solitude since entering Confederation. The West has long been overshadowed by Canada's other great national debate, But as the conflict over natural resources and their effect on climate change heats up, 150 years of antipathy are coming to a head. Janigan takes readers back to a pivotal moment in 1918 when Canada's Western premiers descended on Ottawa, determined to control their own future. And as Margaret Macmillan did in Paris in 1919, she definitely illustrates how the results reverberate to this day. So those are our selections. Josh, do you have any that you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
I'm gonna go with one, and it actually I was laughing when you brought up Alex Epstein because I was gonna go there, but I'm still gonna go there. It's
Great book.
One of my favorite books, and I've really based a lot of my philosophical inclinations on it because Alex Epstein is in fact a philosopher famous for getting into an argument with a Democratic senator while testifying to a Senate committee. That's how he got on my radar. I think it was Barbara Boxer he was going after.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, it's the moral case for fossil fuels, and it really is it's almost like a beginner's. It's great for beginners, political beginners that don't really have these thoughts, and they're trying to figure out how to articulate them, right? Because that is really, once you get into this industry, it's one of those things is you can think things, but you have to be able to articulate them. Alex articulates the concept of energy affordability in a way that I've never seen anybody do it before or since. It is a great foundational book when it comes to the philosophy and the relationship between thriving economic environments, the mistrust of some of these public institutions like the universities and some of the information they're putting out. It, to me, I had these thoughts before I read the book, and this was years ago. But since we're on the topic and Alex has come up, I just like it. I still use the syntax. I'm still pulling things. I read that in Alex's book. Like it was such a profound read for me. And I would recommend that book to anybody. It's a fantastic book. It's great.
And I'll give a shout out to the APP because they actually brought.
They did. I know. I saw.
Epstein
How much did they pay for him? Do you know?
No, I can't say.
Well, I've heard his numbers astronomical.
He's well paid. But he's worth it. He's worth it. Two other books I'll just mention that are on our reading list that are related to that topic, that both of which are very fascinating and actually are very much aligned with what Epstein says in his book, are the Schellenberger book, which is called Apocalypse Never, which our premier referenced in a recent interview on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and also another great book by Bjorn Lomborg called False Alarm. And each of these books, as we mentioned earlier, really posit the same hypothesis that's based upon hard economic data, and that is the best way to save the environment and help the environment is through proper, wise management of natural resources and capitalist development. That is the best way to raise people out of poverty. And when people are raised out of poverty, they start to care and be better stewards of the environment. And that's just the reality. Those are the hard facts. And in fact, the opposite is true. And all of these books also highlight this: that socialist governments are the least respectful of the environment and do the most harm. Of course, we can look around the world and we can look at places like China, for example, that have horrendous environmental records. And I would throw Russia into the same situation, although they do run things on a capitalist basis. The government that they have there is authoritarian, and it's through capitalism, through empowering people, individuals, and helping them to live out their full lives, and to help them self-determine. That is the best way to achieve what the just transition hopes to promise, and that is an environment, to be good environmental stewards, to save the environment, to preserve it for future generations. And really, that is the goal of conservatism. That's what conservatism is by definition. A conservative conserves and actually history and the data show that we do it better than anybody else all time. Anyway, Josh, thank you so much for being with us today. As always, it's been a pleasure for your comments, your very frank comments. And let's hope let's pray that the Alberta government and Albertans will hold fast and resist this invasion. You know, the second shark coming for our yes. So let's hope the music doesn't speed up, because we know what happens when that does.
Well, you know what? If the music speeds up, the gloves are off. Let's go.
Yep,
I mean, like, I think there's enough of us that just, it's kind of like, bring it on. Like, there's really, there's nothing else we can say at this point. Like, if they do what they're planning on, what they seem to be planning on doing, we have no choice. We have to stand up. We cannot bend at the knee this time. No. It's a life or death fight.
Mm-hmm. Well, interestingly, the second shark in the Jaws series was killed through electricity. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's like...
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah.